Good afternoon, and welcome to the October 29th, 2025 Q&A virtual lunch hour. I'm one of your hosts, Jason Colleen. I'm an Assistant Executive Director with the Department of Cannabis Regulation. I just want to remind folks that this is the last weekend to submit renewal records without being subject to the late fees. Beginning Monday of next week, any of the renewal records that are submitted will be subject to those expedited services fees, which will be added as soon as you submit your renewal application. For folks that submit over the next couple of days, please be reminded that all renewal fees are due by end of day on Monday, October 3rd or November 3rd, or you would be subject to late fees. And with that, we can go ahead and hop into questions.
Good afternoon. Our first question comes from Tiana W. Is there an expiration date on Phase 3, Round 2 lottery selectees to apply for a retail license?
So folks that were selected as part of Phase 3 Retail Round 2 had 3 years to submit a pre-application record in a community plan that had not reached undue concentration. And then, of course, if a pre-application is deemed eligible for further processing, businesses have up to 1 year to submit their annual license application. So assuming folks get their pre-app done in time, the application would be eligible to be submitted through December of 2026.
Next question from GOB. When is the next lottery?
We don't have a date for the next lottery right now. Originally, we planned to administer a lottery in December of 2025, and the City Council, via motion, instructed DCR not to conduct that lottery. Hopefully, we'll have a lottery sometime in 2026.
Next question also from GOB. Are there any efforts in adjusting taxes for social equity dispensaries?
So tax policy is subject to consideration by the mayor and city council. The city's Office of Finance is the one who actually is the tax collection agency for the city. They recently transmitted a recommendation about a tax amnesty program, but at this time, I have not seen any proposals that are recommending changes to tax policy.
A question from Coleman S. I've been having issues with the licensing portal. The website isn't working to complete my application. Do you have any updates?
So, I mean, my first recommendation would be to clear your cache in the browser that you're utilizing. Sometimes you have prior versions of websites saved, and then once you've cleared your cache, close out of your web browser, and then reopen the web browser, and then try to access the portal. If you continue to have problems, please reach out to DCR licensing at lacity.org with details and screenshots of your experience, and we can forward it to our software vendor. But generally, clearing the cache and reloading the web page will address any of those issues.
Coleman S. also asks, is there a place for license holders to meet potential dispensary partners?
I'm not sure what the exact question is, but there are different, stakeholder groups that our social equity team gets together. And we've had different types of vendor events where licensees have come and they've just naturally mingled with one another to discuss. I don't believe we have any networking events set up, but we could be seeing some networking events occur in 2026. So just stay tuned to the department's website for future details.
A question from Jay Smith. is there a cultivation lottery this year, and what updates are available for future cultivation licenses?
So there won't be any type of lottery this year, to the extent that the cultivation application process opens up in 2026. We'll make that information available at that time.
From Stephen B. or Steve B. I currently own a local small cultivation license. I would like to stop operating my cultivation and start running a nursery. Can I modify my license type with DCR?
So at the local level, the umbrella cultivation, whether it's a specialty indoor, small, or medium, does allow for the licensee to engage in the nursery activity. If you are looking to change your state license, folks could go ahead and look at modifying your local record to be nursery only, if that's what you choose to do. But the full cultivation license does allow for the license holder to engage in the nursery activity. And if you have questions, I'd recommend reaching out to your licensing analyst.
We had similar questions submitted by Nicholas B. and Pierre R. And there's several rolled it up into one. So Jason, if you need me to repeat any part, let me know. The question is, how do I get a license? What qualifies me to get a license? How long does it take? And how much does it cost?
So, I mean, for all of those questions, I would encourage folks to visit our website. On our website, we have different Q's and A's for the pre-application process, the legal business entity record process, the annual license application process, and we also have links to the municipal code and the rules and regulations. Depending on the license type that you are looking to pursue, there may be a requirement for you to be a social equity applicant. Currently, only social equity applicants can apply for the retail storefront, non-storefront delivery, and cultivation activities. Any applicant has the ability to apply for manufacturing, distribution, transport only, and testing. We did a social equity individual applicant verification process earlier this year. And that gives people the opportunity to get verified as an individual to demonstrate that they meet the income requirements as well as having a prior cannabis-related conviction or arrest. In terms of what qualifies you to get a license, I would recommend reviewing the municipal code. Depending on whether it's a retail storefront or a non-retail license type, the code has the different application processes and how those applications end up getting vetted, whether or not we have to do a community meeting or a public hearing, the environmental review requirements. We also have information about the forms and documents on our website and embedded in the rules and regulations. To get through the local process, it could take, several months if you have all of your paperwork in order. The first step is to make sure that you've, applied for a business tax registration certificate, you've registered your business and created a legal business entity record. And then once you've done that, you have the ability to submit a pre-application record, which is the record that we look at the activities you're trying to conduct. And we do a land use review of the proposed business premises location. If we determine that the proposed location is consistent with our land use and sensitive use restrictions, that record would be deemed eligible for further processing, and you'd have up to a year to submit an annual license application. And then once the annual license application is submitted, it could take 3 to 6 months for it to get processed. And then once you've been issued a notice of complete application and you've paid all of the outstanding environmental fees and any community meeting, public hearing fees, etc., you would get to a determination. And then once we've made a determination to issue a license, we would file your environmental paperwork with the county and upload it to the state. In parallel with the local process, of course, you would have to apply for a corresponding state license through the Department of Cannabis Control, and they would be best situated to explain what their process is. But it could take several months. We've had some folks take, a year to a year and a half to meet all the requirements for licensure. And in terms of the cost, generally it will cost somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000 to go through the application process for a single activity. Certain fees are only applied to a business premises location. Other fees are applied to each of the activities, and more information about that can be found under LEMC section 10419, which has got all of the different fees and how those fees are assessed. Did I miss anything?
I think you got it. Thank you. Our next question comes from Arno K. Can we sell our shares if we are social equity to a non-social equity person?
So any ownership modification of a social equity record does have to go through a modification process. And in order for us to process it, it does have to comply with the equity share requirements under Municipal Code Section 10420. If a social equity business is 100% owned by social equity individual applicants, a portion of that equity could be sold to non-social equity applicants. But depending on the license phase, social equity individual applicants may have to hold up to 51% of the equity or 30 and a third percent of the equity, depending on the phase. So really it will depend on how much equity is held by social equity individual applicants versus non-social equity individual applicants. But if it's 100% owned by social equity individual applicants, a portion of that equity could be transferred to non-social equity individual applicants. If social equity individual applicants currently own the minimum equity requirements, none of the additional equity would be eligible to be sold to a non-social equity individual applicant.
Let's see. Arno K wants to know, how can we get our annual permit fee waived?
So the department does have a limited amount of cannabis equity grant monies from the state to provide fee waivers for renewal applications to social equity businesses. As part of the renewal application intake process, there is a question about whether or not you're a social equity business or a social equity applicant. And if you say yes, it puts you in the queue to be reviewed to determine if you meet the requirements to receive a fee waiver under the grant program. And, our administrative staff would go through and take a look to see if you meet the requirements. For folks that have outstanding fees, you'll have to get back into good standing to be eligible for waivers. And those waivers are only available to verified social equity businesses.
This question comes from James G. He asks, what justification does DCR have to approve an application when the community is against it and the protocol of 700 feet wasn't played into factor?
The municipal code outlines the reasons DCR may deny an application. And, we follow the municipal code in terms of processing applications and making licensing determinations. So if the land use isn't a factor, the distancing from a sensitive use is not a factor, and the applicant meets all of the requirements to be issued a license, DCR will make the recommendation to issue a license. And, ultimately those recommendations are heard through a public hearing, and the Cannabis Regulation Commission can continue to hear public feedback, and they can factor that feedback into their licensing decision. But to the extent that an application does not hit any of the reasons to deny, DCR would recommend issuance of a license even if the community was against the application.
This next one also from James G. The follow-up. It is there something the community can do to stop a cannabis shop from opening when there's 3 cannabis shops on the block?
Well, licensed cannabis, businesses, the retail storefronts have to be at least 700 feet from one another. So you won't see 3 licensed cannabis shops on a city corner. So there may be 3 in a neighborhood. There may be 3 along a commercial corridor, but each of those businesses would be at least 700 feet apart. What we have noticed is members of the community often, unknowingly think that some of the unlicensed shops are actually lawful. And of course, the unlicensed shops are not reviewed by DCR, and we have no say in where those shops are locating. But in terms of the licensed shops, we do make sure that they are properly distanced from sensitive uses and one another before we process their application.
Thank you, Jason. Our next question follows the same theme from Lynn N. Does the community voice matter when opening up a cannabis shop?
As part of the retail storefront application process, once we have reviewed the application and we issue a notice of complete application to the applicant, we do conduct a community meeting where folks are able to submit oral and written input. And then we summarize that oral and written input into our staff report that goes through the public hearing process and goes to the Cannabis Regulation Commission. Members of the community have the ability to participate in the community meeting and the public hearing process to share their thoughts.
This question comes from Mike S. If an existing medical marijuana dispensary has TA through DCR annual license for retail and cultivation, but the licensee chooses not to renew the cultivation activity due to the increased renewal fee and the fact that it realistically won't be operational until 2027 or 2028. Upon refiling the expired cultivation license, would an operating permit be required in order to operate, or would the refiled cultivation record for the EMMD be eligible for temporary approval? And please note that the refiling will occur at the same exact location.
I mean, honestly, there's too many what ifs, and it's going too far out into the future. For temporary approval, to the extent that the business has passed an initial inspection and they can demonstrate that they have an active state license for that activity, we've considered issuing temporary approval. What that looks like, 2 or 3 years in the future with the changing requirements for folks to demonstrate that they have building permits and operating permits. I don't actually know 3 years from now what the city's requirements may be. But whatever is in the municipal code is what we would adhere to at that time. I couldn't guarantee that somebody who refiles in 2028 would be eligible for temporary approval at that time.
Thank you, Jason. This question comes from Mike S. as well. Can DCR please consider a separate fee or process for annual license holders who have non-operational activities on their license so that those activities can be renewed / maintained without breaking the bank?
The application fees are based on the record. To the extent that you have a record for, cultivation, manufacturing, and distribution, and you're not actually engaging in those, manufacturing and distribution, for instance, what you could do is, if you had separate records, each of those records would be subject to the renewal fees based on the operational status. But at this time, DCR has really process the vast majority of annual license applications in its pipeline. And, the renewal fees are based on whether or not temporary approval or an annual license has been issued. And then separately, for the business that are operating, they would have to pay the compliance inspection fee. So, unless your record is less than, 12 months old, it's very likely that we would have processed the annual license application and made a determination to issue an annual license. So, if you're non-operational and you're not utilizing those licenses, you may want to speak with your business consultant and your lawyers to determine whether or not you should continue to maintain those licenses or you should just apply for them at a future date when you're ready to engage in those activities.
The next question comes from Nichelle S. Does DCR take petitions against a cannabis shop into consideration, and will DCR place those petitions in the those petitions in the city/DCR files for future use?
So we do consider community input submitted through the community meeting, and that gets included in our staff report. To the extent that the community input is we don't want a cannabis shop, but there's no reason to deny provided, we would still recommend issuance of a license. Separately, the Cannabis Regulation Commission conducts public hearings for all of the retail storefront applications, and comments and feedback can be submitted to the Cannabis Regulation Commission as well. The commission correspondence is, a public record that is linked to the various agendas. So you would be able to submit that input. But to the extent that the commentary does not, identify a reason to deny, DCR would still recommend issuance of a license.
Our next question comes from Mike S. In regard to the successor in interest form, many beneficiaries prefer not to create a user account on the licensing portal. If this is flagged as a deficiency for the renewal application and not cured, would the renewal be denied? Second part, would DCR be open to accepting the form with the beneficiary's email address in lieu of creating an account in the licensing portal?
It may be a reason to deny. As a best practice, it is important for the identified successor in interest to have their user account so that if the social equity individual applicant becomes deceased, once we've been notified of the social equity individual applicant's death, we can link the user, the successor in interest, to the associated records so that they have access to the records and they can step into the shoes of the social equity individual applicant. To the extent that the beneficiary does not have their own Excella account, we can't link them to anything until they've created that account. And, when people are, dealing with death and going through everything associated with that, the grief process and trying to close out estates and stuff, creating an account through the licensing portal is normally not their top priority. And then there is a finite amount of time for people to comply with the noticing requirements. So it is best to have all of that taken care of when the successor in interest is identified. To the extent that your licensing analyst has identified that there's a deficiency on the forms, you should work with them to address those deficiencies.
Our next question comes from Ivan D. Does the department have a timeline when the PCN is going to open, as it has not opened since 2023?
Not at this point. There were plans to possibly open PCN up at the end of the year when we were planning to conduct the December lottery. But based on the council action to um, not conduct the lottery in December, there are no current plans to open up the PCN process.
Thank you, Jason. This might be the last question, but I'm checking with staff. Let me go ahead and read it. It is from Ivan D. If the PCN is based on council discretion, why do applicants have to wait for the department to open when it comes down to the council member in that community plan area?
So DCR is not required to accept pre-applications in community plan areas that are subject to a finding of undue concentration. And if that process was open-ended, basically you would have different 6-month periods that would be continuously ongoing. And the policymakers of the, council committees that would have to hear the public convenience or necessity request have requested that that window only gets opened for a period of time. We collect the request, we review them, and the ones that meet the requirements only be forwarded to the PCN process so that it's open and closed, and they're not constantly having to consider different requests. And, we've adhered to that request.
We do have an additional question from the chat from Tim A. What is the process for surrendering a LIC and TMP record that business owners no longer wish to operate?
There are withdrawal forms on the website. It really just depends on what the reason is. If you just want to cancel the license or withdraw your application, you can do that. If you've lost site control of your business premises, we have a separate form to surrender your business premises that will result in the closure of that record. And again, those forms are all available on the department's website.
Thank you, Jason. I think we are done with the question.
My pleasure. And thank you for coordinating. I just want to thank everybody for coming today. This is the last Q&A session for the calendar year. So once we have a date for the first one in the new year, we'll go ahead and make sure we get those emails circulated. And if I don't talk to you, I hope everybody has a wonderful holiday season and look forward to talking to you and doing this again in 2026. Bye, everybody.